I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and I'm joined by Professor Kirsten Fermaglich, Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Michigan State University, and for our purposes, most importantly, the author of 2018, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, A History of Jewish Name Changing in America, the winner of the Salvinier Prize in 2019, which is one of the most coveted. It's sort of it's the Oscar of American Jewish history. And it's a fabulous book. It's a work, and you point out in the introduction, is that not only did you have to do the legwork, the spade work on the name-changing experiences of Jews in the United States, but there really wasn't a literature on any name-changing in the United States.
I should say, it was, I was really surprised by how that there was nothing, I wanted to say how little, that there was nothing really about name changing. Really surprised me when I first started this work. It made it really fun. I mean, there had been a little bit of folklore on name changing from the 60s. There had been some, the 1970s, sort of 1970s social historians of the colonial era had used naming to sort of, used how people gave their children names to kind of uncover ideas about childhood and about sort of family life and things like that. But really nothing about name changing of any group. People had maybe, offered a sentence or two or, a couple of paragraphs, but really nobody looked at it. And I just think, it made it fascinating. It made it so much more fun. You never, as a historian, you never get to write about something new. Somebody's always written about it before. So it was really exciting to.
It's hard. I don't want to understand. It's really hard to write about something that nobody else has ever written about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's crazy, right? Like, and I think that there's something to, that historians use names. I mean, everybody uses names as just sort of legible identifiers, right? This is how we identify people. And so the process of thinking about names, right, sort of considering them as subjects in and of themselves, I think is something that people are more hesitant to do. I don't know. I actually can't really understand why people, because it is a really fertile field and the sources are there, so I'm not really sure why people hadn't done it before, but it was very fun. It made it a really exciting kind of adventure. And it allowed me to also, I think, speak to not just a historical audience. A lot of times when historians have lots of other history books that they're arguing with and they're talking to other historians, they're not always talking to, just people on the street wanting to know about their families and their family histories. But because I was going into the archives with the same expectations and understandings that most people look at their own names with, right? Like, oh, my name got changed to Ellis Island, or, oh, we used to have this name and now we have this name and I don't know why, or I saw this movie and I saw a name change, this guy changed his name, he was a real jerk, right? That was pretty much what I was walking into the archives with. So I think that actually made it more exciting and more fun. And I think it made it it made me more want to talk to, my mother and my father and, people down the street and not just other historians, because, I had all these other expectations in my head. So that was really fun. So there are some immigrants in my files, but the majority of the people in name change petitions that I looked at were native-born Americans. And that to me says a couple of things, right? It says that on the one hand, immigrants, if they wanted to change their names, probably did so unofficially. And then if they wanted to go ahead and officially change the name, they could do so on a naturalization petition. So there's still lots of room. If somebody else wants to write another history of Jewish name changing in America, naturalization petitions are a great place to go. And you will find, and you will find other immigrants, not just Jews. You probably won't find the same concentration of Jews that I found, right? Because lots of immigrants are changing their names informally, and then they're naturalizing, and they decide that they want to make that name change official. So that is a really great place to look. It's not where I wound up looking. By looking at actual name change petitions in New York City Civil Court. What I was looking at was a very specific process that was really expensive, number one, and very formal. You had to, sort of post an advertisement in the newspaper. You had to pay a lawyer. It took time, it took money, it took energy. And so it attracted, I think that the nature of that process, and you had to, and the goal of it was very official, right? The goal of it was not to get the woman down the street to call you by a different name because you didn't like being called Rosie and you'd rather be called, Rachel or whatever. You were changing your name because you wanted it to look different on paper. And so the combination of this process, right, both being expensive and also being about sort of suspicions about your identity, really made on paper, your identity on paper, made this a place where Jews were going to be concentrating their efforts. And so the fact that I found so many Jews is in part because this was a process that attracted Jews, both because they had more money to be filing these kinds of petitions. They were the ethnic group, the most recent ethnic group that arrived that had the most money. They were looking for middle-class jobs. And those middle-class jobs were the ones using applications and application forms to not only to decide who they were going to employ, but to keep Jews out. So by the 19-teens and the 1920s, colleges like Columbia University and Harvard University are designing college application forms really with the intent of keeping Jews out. And employment agencies are frequently doing the same thing. They are designing application forms with questions to keep Jews out. So in this kind of space, Jews are, succeeding in the middle class. They are doing very well, right? They're getting jobs. They're seeking better jobs, or consistent jobs to keep them in the middle class. But at the same time, they know that their Jewish identity, they can see in these application forms that their Jewish identity is being scrutinized, that their identity itself is being scrutinized. And so these name change petitions are a way for them to formalize those name changes, make them real on paper so that people can't question them. I don't know if you know the joke about the guy who goes in and asked to change his name from Smith to Jones. And the guy says, "Why do you want to change your name from Smith to Jones?" And he says, "Well, the first time I came in, I want to be able to say that's what my name was first when they asked me instead of Steinberg, right?" There's the sense that these name changes they're being watched, they're being monitored, and people are seeking to avoid that. And so the paper trail of these name change petitions is really important for Jews in a way that it's not for, say, working class Poles or Italians in New York at the same time.
What you also found was that Jews there's this investment in name changing, and it's this interesting convergence of upward mobility and the fears of anti-Semitism, which it's a very confusing time. In World War I, you have Henry Ford, obviously, Father Coughlin. At the same time, Jews are moving. Deborah Dash Moore's book, her first book, about Jews becoming a so-called third settlement of Jews finally making it in America. So it's a confusing time for Jews. Decisions on how to change their names. It's not as if Jews are taking on Christian names or even generic names. And this is the point that you make, is that by changing their names, they are not positioning themselves out of the Jewish community. They're reorienting their identities.
Yeah. No, that was actually something that I didn't really study numerically. I'm not a linguist. I didn't do maybe the kind of work that a linguist might have done and sort of, being able to type the different kinds of names that people were changing to. But I would say, really, people are not looking for Christian names. They actually, there's an interesting newspaper and this is for refugees from Nazi Germany, the Aufbau, which was a newspaper for people who had left Germany in the 30s. They actually, that journal published something saying, well, if you want to change your name, that's fine, but watch out for the American sounding names. Americans don't like it when you take their names, right? Their heroes' names. So don't take a name like Washington or Lincoln. And in fact, that's true, right? Jews are not taking those kinds of names. The way I like to describe it is they are taking on the most anodyne names they can find. They are looking for the names that mean nothing, that say nothing, that allow them to be invisible, that allow them to kind of to blend in a crowd. And you want to think about the ways that names that were distinctively Jewish, as I was talking about, like Goldstein or Greenberg, were names that called attention to themselves. And you can see that actually coming up in some of the people's petitions. This name is embarrassing. This name calls attention to itself. And what they were looking for were names frequently with the same initial. That's something that I think just runs throughout Jewish culture, using initials as a means of naming, both for first names, but also for last names. Sometimes they would lop off, so Greenberg would become Green for sure, but people would also just use any kind of very anodyne name to, so it wouldn't sound American, it wouldn't sound Christian. And I really reject the notion that people are Americanizing their names. I mean, that's something that I feel pretty strongly about, both because these people are born in America, right? What's an American name anyway, right? Why is Greenberg or Goldstein not an American name? And in fact, they are American, right? They're born in America. I mean, there's not much else they can do, right? They're looking for names that they can hide with. They're looking for names, not even hide, that's too strong. They are not looking to leave the Jewish community. They are not looking, for the most part. And there are examples of people who were converting. There are examples of people, I've had people come up to me and tell me about their family members who changed their names and converted and left the Jewish community. So I would not say that doesn't happen, but the large majority of the people in my petitions and the large majority of other evidence that I found mostly finds that people are just looking to get by. They see these names as being things that are standing in their way. It calls attention to them. They face maybe embarrassment or ridicule. People make fun of their names, and they know that they're not getting jobs because of those names. They know that they're not getting into schools because of those names, right? And so they're just looking for something to kind of avoid having those names, because they're trying to avoid this kind of a marker of being Jewish. It doesn't mean they're leaving Jewishness altogether, but they don't want that to be marking them in a more public space, basically.
Now, it's a different experience I imagine, for Jewish men or for Jewish women. Very often, Jewish women will have to change their names one way or another in this period when they wish to get married.
Well, and that's what I thought was really fascinating, both because of that, right? Just the basics of the way that our naming system, the Anglo-American naming system pretty much works in the US, that women change their names upon marriage, and it used to be much more forcible, actually, right? Like, it used to be very, very hard not to change your name as a woman. But actually and also because there are lots of images, I started out with a lot of stereotypes. I mean, I usually start out my public talks by talking about the stereotypes of name changing, right? Everybody's cultural image. And everybody's cultural image of a name changer is usually a man, right? It's usually someone who is either an immigrant, getting his name changed, or else it's, an immigrant who's like seeking to, get rid of his family and, shake off his old world roots and make his way in the new world. But actually what I find, and I think that I think that the story of women is one of the most interesting parts of the story, because in fact, beginning in the early, what you really see as this phenomenon grows is that part of why it's growing is that women are changing their names in larger and larger numbers. So at the beginning of the 20th century, women are a minuscule proportion of the people changing their names, always under 10%. By the 30s, women are about a third of all the name changers. And by the 50s, they're 50-50. They're half of all the name changers. So there really, it is, and actually, and then at the end of my book, I actually talk about the fact non-Jewish women are now the majority. Name changing has become feminized in the New York City name change files. It is more women than men who change their names now for very different reasons. But I think that what's really interesting is that for women, even at this time, a lot of these women are changing their names with their husbands or with their children, but a lot of them are also changing them alone. They are working. And Jewish women entering the workforce, I think, is one of the major forces that actually allows Jews to become more middle class at this time, right? Jewish women, unlike Italians, unlike other, white ethnic groups, knowing that not all Jews are white, but at this time, sort of the large majority coming from Eastern Europe, in comparison to other ethnic groups, Jewish women are going to school and trying to get pink collar jobs at levels that are higher than other ethnic women. And they are looking for name changes as they do that, right? In order to get those jobs as secretaries, as, I'm trying to think, it was mostly secretaries, but, salespeople, all kinds of different jobs that they're looking for, stenographer, all kinds of things. They realize that they too need those name changes, even if it's only going to last them a couple of years, right? Even, I have files from women who are 25, 26, probably they're only going to use that name for another 5-6 years before they get married and change it anyway. But it was important to them financially. Right. Yeah. I mean, that was something that, to them made a big difference economically. And it may have made a big difference socially to them too, depending on who they were meeting at work and, who they were hoping to marry and things like that as well. But yeah, I was really surprised to find that women actually are doing this, along with men and actually on their own as well, in ways that really did kind of shake my assumptions. But I think it really does help to understand why and how Jews, this kind of push for upward mobility is so important to Jews. And Jewish women also are facing more anti-Semitism than men in the workforce. Jewish women's bodies, Everett Van Prell has written about this. Jewish women's bodies, their voices are all deemed unacceptable for the workforce, right? So a Jewish woman with a name like Goldstein is going to be more questioned in an employment agency than a man might. And so I think that helps to explain in part why women are doing this in much larger numbers than we might imagine.
And as you point out, that this is a phenomenon which changes over time. Different people engage in name changing. And of course, there is that financial piece, and it's freighted with all sorts of great meanings, social and religious and ethnic and economic. When is there a tipping point? Maybe when is there a petering out point in which Jews no longer, what does that say when Jews no longer have the lion's share of applications to change their names?
To me, it was really fascinating that actually the disproportionate numbers of Jews in the files does not go down until the 80s, actually, until the 80s. So the numbers decline, beginning really after 1948, the numbers decline, but they still stay very high, and they stay higher than they were, before World War II. It's not until the 80s that Jews are really no longer in the files and no longer disproportionate. So, I think it says something about the continuing anti-Semitism, the continuing ways that names continue to mark Jews, that Jewish names continue to be seen as funny names. I received the Lowenstein-Wiener Fellowship from the American Jewish Archives in the 1990s. And I joked with friends about, who wants the Lowenstein-Wiener? Everybody wants a better name, right? Nobody wants the Lowenstein-Wiener Fellowship. I'm sorry, AJA. That's because that's a funny name, right? Those are embarrassing names. They're ridiculous names, right? To me, it sort of is a testament that this is still this lingering anti-Semitism in the way we perceive Jewish names and the Jewish people who hold those names. But it is indeed true that by the 60s and 70s and 80s, in part because Jews are leaving the city. So there are fewer Jews in the city. But also it is about, I think, declining anti-Semitism as it becomes harder or more illegal to ask people about their ethnic background on applications and in college application forms and on employment application forms. Jews, I think, feel more accepted. They don't feel like a Jewish name is a threat or a danger. And so, name changing, I think, goes down because it doesn't, I think that Jewish names don't necessarily pose the same kinds of institutionalized threats to upward mobility. Which doesn't mean that they're not still, as I say, sort of facing some elements of ridicule, some measure of sort of a sense of embarrassment about having a Jewish name. But it's not the same kind of institutionalized, I can't get a job, which I think was really what pushed the Jews to change their names in the very beginning, was very real economic and practical desires, right? Get a job, go to school, those kinds of things.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.